coming today. Really appreciate you coming to the briefing we're having today with respect to babies in the budget 2024. I first want to thank the Mamas Caucus, the Dads Caucus, and the Babies Caucus for co-hosting this event. My name is Bruce Leslie. I'm president of First Focus on Children. We are so happy to have you all here today, and also I'm pleased to have the participation today in our panel with our partners 0 to 3 and Schoolhouse Connection. We're also particularly pleased to welcome Stacy and Haley, who are mothers from DC and Virginia, and made time in their busy schedules today to join our discussion on the importance of investing in our youngest children. Thank you both. To start today's conversation, we are pleased to be joined by Vijay Das, who's the Legislative Director for Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, to share the great work of the Congressional Mamas Caucus. So thank you.
Thanks. Everyone hear me okay? All right. So on behalf of Congresswoman Tlaib, I'm thrilled to be here at this event, co-representing the work of the Congressional Mamas Caucus. My boss, alongside Congresswoman Bush, Jaya Paul, Meng, and Nikema Williams, co-founded the caucus in July 2022. And we were advocating on behalf of mothers across the country. You know, I wish my boss could have been here today, but she's back in Michigan. You know, bad timing, I guess, given early recess, but she told me to send her regards. You should know that Rashida loves babies, and everyone who is probably chuckling knows why. If she hears a baby, literally when I'm staffing her in the chamber or she's on the House floor, she hears a baby crying, she's gonna run towards it to try to console. And I actually saw this happen in the flesh my first 2 weeks on the job. During a Dads Caucus briefing, when a baby was crying, she literally got up, middle of the panel presentation, and went to console the baby. And the baby didn't know what was happening, the mother didn't know what happened. It was pretty hilarious. So I just want to give a little bit of background with the Mamas Caucus. You know, the idea of the Mamas Caucus came together actually when a Detroit group called Mothering Justice wanted my boss to help start a caucus focused on mothers of color in particular, when they were dealing with a lot of stress during the height of the pandemic. And the caucus, you know, is something in which it's not only representative of mothers, but dads and anyone who really cares about care in this country, from the members of Congress that represent them and the folks that staff the caucus itself. Now, you should know that we come from this perspective from the Mothers Caucus with a lot of shared priorities. But, you know, I think for a lot of us, we just understand that the cost of raising a child in this country is just too alarmingly high. And so for all the talk, at least of what I've heard my boss talk about, that we pride ourselves on being a nation of opportunity, I still reiterate, and I've said this many times before, even outside of this capacity, it's sort of embarrassing that a kid's health is really dependent, health, education, and life outcomes remains dependent on the zip code in which they were born and the neighborhood in which they were born in this nation. So I've seen this in our district, back in Michigan, outside Detroit, and in Detroit, in Michigan writ large. You know, we see the rise of the Black infant and maternal health crisis. And I just know this, having worked a little bit on the issue in Michigan. Michigan has one of the highest pregnancy-related death rates. So my boss knows that we are facing a real care crisis in general, both in this front and others, where infants and toddlers are not getting the investments they need to live and thrive. So from paid time to care, to affordable child care, to safe and accessible housing, this nation is failing our next generation. And it really pains my heart that every Congress, we go through appropriation season and we don't invest in our kids, and my boss feels the same way. You know, I've been inside this building for only a couple months now, but I've been working with Bruce and others for many years, fighting for a fair chance for our kids. And it's sort of like difficult to grapple with all the obstacles in our way. But I'm just really encouraged to see this generation, the next generation, still remain really well versed in the fight, bring new data and research that brings us here today. So I'm really excited to hear about what we have in store, and I'll be sitting like all of you taking notes, and hopefully we can work together and build a movement that actually brings some of these policies to life. Thanks again.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much, Vijay. And I'll verify his story. I was at that briefing, and one of the panelists was actually, it was her baby, and the baby started crying. You could tell the panelist was very anxious because, you know, her kid was crying, but she couldn't do anything because she was on the panel, and Congresswoman Tlaib jumped up and consoled the child. It was awesome. And so I can verify that story. And also want to point out that these three caucuses came together for the very first time last year for this very event. So this is the second year we've done this. We did this last year also with year 3. And so we're very excited that they came together again today for this purpose. So today we're really excited about releasing the Babies in the Budget 2024 report. We will be getting hard copies to people in the very near future. For many years, First Focus on Children has produced a broader children's budget book that if you haven't seen it, I hope you get it, and you can call us and get copies of it. But we analyzed the full array of kid programs in the federal budget and the impact on children. Both these reports are essential tools, I think, and very, we hear from congressional staff and advocates that they're very useful to them, and they help identify trends in federal spending on children's programs. They bring awareness to shortfalls and help provide accountability for our nation's children. We look forward to the release of the children's budget book this fall, so we'll be releasing that in September. But to bring back today, I'm really excited to be talking about babies in the budget, so babies and toddlers, and how we are investing or not investing in them. One of the reasons that this is so important for us to look at the spending on babies separately from children as a whole is due to the unique stages of development that occur in the first few years of life. Early investments can make immediate improvements to the well-being of a child, to their attachment, to their brain development, to their health, as well as provide a strong foundation for them as they grow and learn. Unfortunately, our federal budget makes it abundantly clear that babies and toddlers are not always a priority for some lawmakers. In a moment, my colleague, Chris Becker, will provide an overview of the findings of this year's Babies in the Budget report. But first, I want to share a couple of statistics that help emphasize the state of our nation's youngest children. But first of all, as Vijay noted, U.S. infant mortality rates and maternal mortality rates are, crazy high. And for the first time, the infant mortality rose for the first time in 20 years. And so that is an unacceptable trend, and we are way higher than other wealthy nations across the world. In addition, recent studies have shown that children are at the greatest risk of housing eviction, with households involving children under the age of 5 making up the largest group of households that have had evictions filed against them. We also note that children, the youngest children, are also most likely to be victims of child abuse and neglect. And there are also 15.3% of households with one or more children ages 0 to 2 experience low or very low food security. And last, children, the youngest children in our nation actually are the demographic with the highest rates of child poverty in this country. It makes no sense. Like that, if we're gonna protect anybody, it should be babies and toddlers from child poverty. This should not be the reality our children face. We can and are able to provide them with better outcomes. Research shows us overwhelmingly that money matters, and investments across all aspects of their lives, their health, child care, income support, housing, nutrition, and other areas, improve children's long-term success. Increasing investments for children is also widely popular with the American people. In a recent study, the American people expressed grave concern that children lacked political power, but they also believed that children were the second highest deserving group to receive support and help from public policy. A May 2022 Lake Research Partners poll finds that by a 90 to 8% margin, voters said that investing in children helps improve their lives, development, and outcomes. And by an 89 to 7% margin, voters believe that investing in children has a large return in a healthy society and a healthy economy. So the public gets this overwhelmingly. And our pollster would note that the numbers against were 8 and 7%. Her point was, we're in a time where 25% of people in this country are so cynical, they oppose everything. So her point was, you're getting 2/3 of the people who are against everything, who are all about investing in kids. So these numbers are pretty remarkable. I would also point out in that same poll, by a 66 to 7% margin, voters believe we are investing too little rather than too much on reducing child abuse and neglect. By a 66 to 10% margin, voters believe we're investing too little rather than too much on reducing child poverty. By a 64 to 5% margin, voters believe we're investing too little rather than too much on reducing child hunger. That's a 13-to-1 margin. And by a 65 to 8% margin, voters believe we're investing too little rather than too much on reducing child homelessness. And by a 56 to 10% margin, voters believe we're investing too little rather than too much on early childhood education. So overwhelmingly, voters believe in an investment agenda. And when Congress returns in September, they will have to make many important funding decisions. History has shown us that when negotiations get tough, unfortunately, children tend to be losers in those debates. They are perceived to be the easy thing to cut, but it does not make sense. It is actually for their future and our nation's future. It is a mistake. And so we're here to make that case that investing in our children, including our babies and toddlers, is critically important. So we want to thank you all for coming here today to learn more about how we are currently funding programs and making investments that support infants and toddlers and their families, and the impact federal dollars can have on their lives. With that, I'd like to now introduce Chris Becker. He's the Vice President of Budget Policy and Data Analytics at First Focus on Children, to take us through this year's findings. So, Chris.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and thank you to all of you for showing up and hearing about where we stand in terms of our support for babies. So the goal of the babies budget is to understand whether the federal budget is making babies a priority. And so we look across the entire federal budget and try to understand how much of the money in the budget is going to children from 0 to 3. We're going to talk about the share of funding, so what percentage of that money is going to babies, and also what direction we're heading. Are we increasing our funding on babies, or are we actually losing ground? And so before I get into the results, I want to emphasize how comprehensive this is. We analyzed over 150 programs that in some way affect babies across 11 different departments and countless bureaus. And there are going to be programs in the babies budget that focus directly on children, or on babies, where 100% of that money is going to babies. And then we're also going to look at programs that a portion of the money is going to babies. So think of something like Medicaid, where that money does serve people of all ages. In those cases, we're going to try to get at how much of the money is actually going to babies. And so there's kind of 3 different levels that we look at. We're going to look at the overall numbers for the entire budget. So just out of all federal spending, mandatory and discretionary, how much of it is going to babies. And then we're also going to break down the results by issue area. So we're going to have 6 issue areas that I'm going to go over in a second, that to see the trends and the how things are going in across different areas that matter a lot for babies. Okay. And then we also, in the broader budget book, have analysis for each individual program in the book. The 6 areas that we look at in the book are early childhood, income support, health, justice and child protection, housing, and nutrition. So unfortunately, our main results are not very positive. We find that in fiscal year 2024, only about 1.52% of the entire federal budget goes to babies. So there's a really small amount of our money that's actually ending up in the hands of families who are trying to take care of children 0 to 3. And not only is this a really low share, it is actually declining over time. And so we peaked at almost 2% of federal funding going to babies in 2021, when there was a lot of COVID-era programs that were instituted that disproportionately helped babies. Things like expansion of the child tax credit and expanding its refundability. Things like a temporary bump up in the Child Care and Development Block Grant. All these programs that helped a lot of people, but especially helped babies. And unfortunately, over time, most of those programs the expansion of those programs have expired. And so we have 3 years in a row where the share of spending on babies is falling. And in particular, it fell from 1.66% in 23 to 1.52% in 2024. So babies are not a big priority in the federal budget, and if anything, they're becoming less and less of a priority over time. The other way we can look at our spending on babies is to ask whether our spending is keeping up with inflation. So we're giving money to families to pay for health care, for providing food, to provide for nutrition of babies, but at the same time, prices for all those things are going up. And so if we were to keep funding flat and prices are going up on the other end, basically that's a cut. And so we want to know, is the spending that we're having for babies keeping up with inflation? And unfortunately, we find in that regards, we are falling behind as well. And so there is a very, very small increase in our funding of babies in absolute numbers. But when we adjust for inflation, that spending on babies is falling by a little bit over 2%. And so our support for babies is not keeping up with the rising prices that families are facing when they actually go to provide for their youngest children. And again, this is the third straight year that this is true. This is the third straight year where the spending on babies is not keeping up with inflation. And when we look at just what drives this decline over the last year from fiscal year 23 to 24, and we break it down program by program, there is one program that overwhelmingly drove the decline over the last year, which is that during the pandemic, we had a large expansion of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program so that people could meet the nutrition needs of babies and children of all ages. And unfortunately, those expired in 2023. And so there was a huge cut over, for the program overall, but just looking at the part of that program that goes to babies from 0 to 3, we find that alone, there was a over $2 billion cut between 23 and 24. So that's a huge decline in terms of the money that is going to families with babies. And that one cut alone actually explains the entire decline that we see over the course of the year. And so basically, in other words, had we just kept SNAP funding where it was, we would have seen actually a really small increase in the spending on babies, and instead we get a decline. So it's really the number one driver. What makes that even sadder is that that's really on top of a lot of other programs that have already gone away. So it's kind of the last domino to fall in terms of all the great programs that we enacted during the COVID recession and pandemic. So if you're looking at the culprit for the recent decline, it's SNAP, by far and away the most important. The good news is that there were some expansions in some discretionary programs that at least cushioned that blow for families with babies. So the most notable one there is that there was an increase in WIC spending, which went up by 14% even after adjusting for inflation. And so that WIC increase was not nearly enough to make up for the loss in SNAP funding, but at least made things a little bit better than they could have been. We also saw a couple other discretionary programs increase from 23 to 24, including a few different housing programs, such as tenant-based housing assistance, project-based housing assistance, and homeless assistance grants. And then there were also a few early childhood programs, such as Child Care and Development Block Grant and Head Start, that also saw increases in funding. So these are not enough to make up for the cuts, but at least there is something that we got out of fighting for these wins in the legislative process. Now, we can see a path towards a better future, and a lot of the good things that we could do are present in the president's budget for fiscal year 2025. And in particular, the number one thing that the president's budget does, which would be a huge win for babies, is an expansion of the refundability of the child tax credit. So we only track the refundable portion of the child tax credit, and just looking at that alone, there would be a $28 billion increase for babies just from the child tax credit expansion alone. So that's a huge number, and it would make up over 80% of the increase for babies in the in the president's budget. So in terms of priorities, child tax credit really is, is right at the top of the list. Overall, there's a $38 billion increase in the president's budget just for babies. That includes other new programs such as Affordable Child Care for America and National Paid Leave. So I think it's fair to say that in the president's budget, there are a lot of huge wins for babies and for their families. That's kind of the overall picture. We also look at how the trends that we're seeing from 2020 to 2024, so the last several years, in our different issue areas that we're tracking. And so overall, it's a bit of a mixed bag. We see that income support and justice and child protection have declined over time in terms of their share of federal spending, but we've seen increases in housing, nutrition, health, and early childhood. Again, just looking at the portion of that money that's going to babies. So nutrition, despite the awful SNAP cuts that I talked about earlier, we still are up a bit from where we were in fiscal year 2020. So there has been, a good increase in nutrition over time, but most of that was chiseled away in the last year because of the SNAP cuts. If we look at income support, that one unfortunately is down. We had a huge peak here in fiscal year 2021, again, largely due to the child tax credit, but we've been on a downward trend since then, unfortunately. Health is one of the biggest areas where we see a big increase, and so the share of federal spending on health for babies is up by 40%. This is a great thing to see, and Avery in a minute will talk about some of the specifics of maternal and infant health and well-being. The other thing I would point out here is that a lot of this is driven by a big increase in Medicaid. So Medicaid matters a lot for babies. In early childhood, we see an increase of 6.1%, so that one's up as well. Housing, we also see, is up by about 30%. This is still a really small share, so there's just not a lot of money in the housing budget that's going to babies. And I would also emphasize that we have some data suggesting that the share of money going to babies is declining over time as well. So that's my caveat to the housing section. And then finally, justice and child protection. That one also has declined over time by about 6%. So that's kind of a peek into the different issue areas. For a lot more detail on that, I would refer you to the overall book. But with that, I think I will turn it over to Avery to talk about early childhood and maternal health.
Thanks so much, Chris. Hi, everybody. I'm Avery Takulis. I am on the policy staff at First Focus on Children, and I handle early childhood and public health. And I just wanted to dive a little deeper on the infant and maternal health and well-being numbers that Chris touched on. We do see, actually, you'll start, when we're talking about infant and maternal health and well-being, we're certainly looking at health programs like Medicaid and others, but we also took into account, in a fact sheet that I think is available at the front table, programs like WIC, the Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood Home Visiting Program, and when we're looking at the President's proposed budget, his proposal for a paid family medical leave program. We also could probably argue that every single program that we look at has an impact on infant and maternal health, but we drew the line somewhere. So that's sort of what we looked at to come up with the numbers that we did. And we do see an increase of 39.7% in the share of federal funding going to infant and maternal health and well-being programs between FY 2020 and FY 2024. Chris touched on, this is largely due in part to Medicaid, and those Medicaid increases came when there were continuous coverage requirements during the COVID-19 pandemic. So some of that funding has started to come down, especially during the Medicaid unwinding process that we're seeing states go through now. A couple of important infant maternal health programs that saw gains during that time are infant and early childhood mental health, vaccines for children, the, as I mentioned, infant and early childhood home visiting program, screening and treatment for maternal depression, and safe motherhood and infant health programs. But one of the largest programs that helps mothers and babies is the Maternal and Child Health Services Block Grant, and that, the dollars have increased slightly for that over the last few years, but in inflation-adjusted funding, it has lost 3%. It lost 3% between FY23 and FY24, which is a concerning trend. And the share of federal funding for infant and maternal health and well-being overall peaked in FY23 at 0.8% of the federal budget, and it fell to 0.75% in 2024. So I think, you know, now mentioned a couple of times, really troubling infant and maternal mortality numbers that people are now very well aware of. But we can see that when we're funding these programs that help infants and their families at less than 1% of the federal budget, there's a clear reason why we're not making the gains that we need to in those areas. I'll touch very briefly on the President's FY 2025 budget proposal, which has some good news. It would increase the federal share slightly from 0.75 to 0.75% of the federal budget to 0.78%, still well below 1%. We do see some positive increases for Healthy Start, which has threatened elimination over the last couple of appropriation cycles. The budget would require states to provide 12 months of postpartum Medicaid coverage and create an optional Medicaid benefit that would expand some maternal support services, postpartum support services. And we do see, as I said, in dollars, a slight increase for the Maternal and Child Health Services Block Grant, but not enough to keep up with inflation, to go back to what Chris said earlier, that we do see some increases, but costs keep increasing as well. So sort of and of course, I'm sorry, the paid family medical leave proposal, which would do great things for infant and maternal health. We have a lot of science that shows that when those benefits are in place, families and their children do better. But we do have a mixed bag. I think the proposal would provide some important increases, but it's just not enough to make a dent in those really concerning infant maternal mortality numbers that we see across the country. So some good news, some not so good news. And we go into a little more detail in the book and then in the fact sheet. So, Chris, I'll hand it back. Are we doing questions now? Or take some questions. Okay. And I'm going to hand this back to Chris, and maybe I'll just hang out here if anybody has any questions. And then if not, we'll turn to our panel.
I think I should definitely defer that to Michelle or Bruce, if either of you want to chime in.
Yeah, sure. Excellent point. It is very concerning, and we are working with a number of different advocacy organizations to ensure that SNAP does not see these cuts, and that in order to protect SNAP, we aren't cutting other nutrition programs that benefit children and families. And I would take this opportunity to also say that Chris pointed out some of the discretionary programs that saw an increase, and it is due to the leaders of these caucuses and other champions in Congress who have really fought hard during the appropriations process, and probably your members, some of your members as well, and hopefully all of them, and then our advocacy partners who are in the room today. We really work together on the SNAP and WIC provisions. And we'll talk a little bit more about how all these programs work together to ensure kids have a healthy foundation to grow and thrive. But yes, we are very concerned about what we're looking at with SNAP, however they propose to do it, and certainly would not want to see them trade off other children's programs to bump up SNAP. I mean, that's a battle we're in, and look for more partners to be loud and make that an important priority for our children. Bruce, anything you want to add? No? He's shaking his head. Okay. Thank you for the question. That's an important one.
If there's no other questions, maybe we can turn it over.
Oh.
Anything else?
People are staring at me, so my, okay, sorry.
Can you hear Michelle okay?
Got it. Well then, Patty, come on. Thank you, Christine. It's a lot of work putting all this together, so I really appreciate all the background work and spreadsheet management and all of that for us to be here today. So I am Michelle Dallafor. I am the Senior Vice President for Budget and Tax at First Focus Campaign for Children, First Focus on Children, both places. And I oversee a large coalition called the Children's Budget Coalition. Members sitting here next to me. And we spend a lot of time using this publication and the children's book. Oh, God. How about that? Michelle, you won't have to tell me a third time. Using these publications when we make visits on the Hill to point out some of the trends that are happening, and in this case, to really underscore, we are not even spending 2% of the federal budget on our youngest children. I mean, even under the president's budget, we get to the 1.99, but we're not even at 2%. So we have some work to do, but again, I would say the good news is we have very enthusiastic supporters and champions in Congress who are working on both sides of the Capitol to help us bump that number up significantly. So with that, then, I'm going to introduce our panel and get going. And I have to look down because I'm going to put your words in the wrong order, Patty. Senior Director of Federal Policy at 0 to 3. I think I wanted to start. Anyway, and Patty Cole, and then Erin Patterson is the Director of Education Initiatives at Schoolhouse Connection. And then I am delighted that we have two local moms with us who also, we're also giving you the title, I think, of Strolling Thunder Family Advocates as well. And we are just so pleased that you can make time to be here with us today. And so, we just talked a little bit about all the things that are happening in Congress, some of the challenging trends that our youngest are facing and their families. And as a former Hill staffer, I always felt it was really important to hear directly from constituents and families. And so again, just very thrilled that both of you could be here today. And Stacey, I'm gonna turn to you first to talk a little bit about your family experiences, and maybe share with us a little bit about your children and just how the programs we're talking about today matter to your family. And thank you for being here.
Hi, I'm Stacey Adams. I live here in DC. I'm a mother of 4 children. My son Aiden, he's 8. Zoe is 5, and then I have Onika, who's 2, and I have Ostacia, who's 6 months. So, and I was a Strolling Thunder participant. I got to meet with Eleanor Norton Holmes, well, one of the staffers. I wasn't able to meet with her, but I work here in DC. I work for DC government. I help to reduce gun violence. I work at the ONE's office, the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. And all of these programs matter a lot to me. I can tell you that back during the pandemic, I actually received the child tax care credit for my 2 oldest children, and it made such a difference in my household. Now I'm in a house, but then I was living in a 1-bedroom with a den, and we just moved in like 3 months ago, so praise God. But there was a lot of challenges, and the money helped with so many different things, even exposing my kids to different activities allowing them to do different things that I didn't have the money for. You know, I do have WIC, so that's very important to me as well. It provides me with fruits, vegetables, eggs, milk. We have the farmer's market during this season. And also my two youngest are on they have a actual child care voucher. So I utilize all these programs, and I'm happy to know that, you know, the president is gonna increase this. And I do think, you know, children matter, they're the future. Like, I'm looking at my kids and I'm like, when I'm old, you're gonna be running this country. So I feel like all of our resources should be put to enrich them and to like increase their minds. They're like sponges at this age. And so that's why I'm here, just to share my motherhood experience with you guys.
Haley, and I know you have a childcare experience to talk about a little bit too.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Haley Sable. I live in Arlington, Virginia, and my wife and I have a 14-month-old child. So, you know, I don't have 4 kids, but sometimes the 14-month-old feels like 4 kids. Yeah, my wife and I are both public school teachers. We work for Fairfax County Public Schools. I teach middle school, 13, 14-year-olds. My wife teaches elementary school. And when we were getting ready to expect Andy, basically we had the experience of having to use all of our sick leave that we had built up for like 8+ years of working for the county. My wife did not even qualify for short-term disability because the baby was born like 2 weeks before summer started, and they don't count time that you're not on contract. So that was a really like eye-opening experience for us. We wanted to spend as much time with the baby, obviously, and thankfully we had the summer off to do so. And my wife's parents like helped us, and we managed to put together care. But it really made me think about how difficult that is in a way that it should not be, because you have a newborn. When it was time to get Andy enrolled in childcare, we had lined up a spot at a home childcare near where we worked, and about like a month before we were supposed to start, she contacted us and notified that there was no longer a spot available, which was obviously very stressful. We felt like we didn't have a lot of options. We were able to find a spot when I was supposed to go back to work, but it ended up being like not a very good fit, and part of that was because we had this time crunch to find somewhere with an available spot within a month. We've actually since withdrawn Andy from that childcare for the summer, and we're going to start somewhere new because we had to fight the childcare provider on things that are like very basic, like safe sleep practices and like no screens for a 1-year-old. So these are things that like you just you just don't really think about it until you have your own child and you have very specific desires and hopes and dreams for them, and then you realize how hard it is to get them where they need to be. So yeah, that's been our experience so far.
Well, I thank you both for sharing, and we definitely will come back to the child tax credit, and I'm sure we will talk more about the child care piece too, because it is our hope that we will see some supplemental funding to support the child care programs in September, for example. So now, Patty, I'm going to turn it over to you. So we've heard about a number of different programs. You saw that we have 6 different sections in the book, 11 departments, numerous agencies and bureaus. So in your experience, Patty, can you talk a little bit about the importance of how all these programs work together to build a good foundation for our youngest? Please.
Right, is this on?
Yeah.
Thanks, Michelle. And I just want to thank First Focus for continuing to put a spotlight on the baby share of the budget, which is an important measure of where babies stand in our national estimation. And I will just say that babies, it's obviously under 2% of the budget. They make up 3.3% of the nation's population. And if you look at babies who are experiencing poverty, as Bruce talked about, it's actually 6% of the poverty population. So often when I talk about working at 0 to 3, people think that we work on, they just assume that we work on childcare, and that's our issue. But in fact, strong early development is influenced by many factors long before a baby enters childcare. They do. So children don't come with just one need, as you've heard Stacy and Haley say. They come with many, and that starts with the prenatal care for moms, as Avery talked about. So many of the programs in the baby budget help families directly. So we've heard about WIC, we've heard about childcare, there's housing, and medical assistance, and those are really direct to families. But there's some at the community level that really focus on safety in neighborhoods and green spaces and community services. But then there are others that are still more global, and they address factors that are largely outside the control of parents. But the role they play in ensuring babies grow up healthy is really immense, and particularly environmental programs. So when they reduce air pollutants or lead in the water, that can really help boost development, because they really do jeopardize healthy development. And climate change can have an outsized impact on the youngest children, whose smaller bodies are more vulnerable to heat and to cold. And they feel the stress that it causes, and that has an impact on their development. So it's important that we invest in all of these areas, because all children need a range of ingredients to help them thrive. And they interact with each other. So the availability of transportation, for example, affects families' ability to provide economic security through jobs when they can access them, or through childcare. Energy assistance is really important. We find that families tell us that when they talk about the things that worry about them, it's not just housing or food, but also paying their utilities is a really big worry. So all of these programs kind of fit together. And it's not just the share, it's the range of investments that the baby budget represents, and that's so important.
Thank you very much, Patty, and you teed up the next piece of the conversation here. So Erin, you do a lot on ensuring our youngest have safe, healthy housing. So, and Patty's already mentioned this, but could you talk a little bit about what you've seen, even during the pandemic, and like what some of the research maybe shows about trends we're seeing in the housing area, and then some of the specific programs that you all really spotlight and target that make a big difference for families and our youngest?
Thanks. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Schoolhouse Connection is so happy to be here in this conversation. Our mission is overcoming homelessness through education. And I want to level set first. As you all know, we have 2 different federal definitions of homelessness. And so when we talk about overcoming homelessness, we are using the McKinney-Vento definition, which is utilized by the U.S. Department of Education and most federally funded early childhood programs. And it defines homelessness as children and youth who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And it's important to say that because when you hear the word homeless, you might immediately picture someone sleeping on the street or sleeping in a shelter. And that is true. And the McKinney-Vento Act also expands prioritization to children who experience homelessness in motels or hotels because their families have nowhere else to stay. They can't pay the whole month's rent, but they can pay a couple nights in a motel. Importantly, those who are living in doubled up settings, sleeping with others, staying on a couch, going from one place to another from week to week. And that's actually the largest portion of children experiencing homelessness, including infants and toddlers. And so when you think about the impacts on children's development, I heard Haley mention safe sleep practices. It is very hard to establish and maintain a sleep routine and safe practices when you are in and out of shelter, a motel that is not designed for an infant or toddler, sleeping on a couch, positioning your baby so that they don't roll off in the middle of the night. And all of these impacts build and they scaffold over time. And so what Stacy mentioned earlier is the best way to describe it. Infants and toddlers are sponges. And they are not only absorbing all of the developmental milestones along the way, they're also absorbing the trauma and the stress that their parent or the adult in that situation is experiencing. And so when we think about access to all of these programs for infants and toddlers, it's then even more critical. It's important for all children to be enrolled in high quality early childhood development programs, but the role of those programs becomes outsized for an infant or toddler experiencing homelessness, who is behind now in their motor skills because they didn't have enough space to play and do tummy time and learn how to roll over. And so those things and many more are the reason why access to high quality early childhood development is important. But what we hear from the field, from parents and providers, is that it's very hard for those families to access the programs that can help them, either because they start experiencing homelessness in November and no slots are available, even though programs are able to reserve slots for homeless families. Or Patty mentioned transportation, just the tactics of getting somewhere on a consistent basis is difficult for families experiencing homelessness. Not even to mention the stigma associated, because homelessness is often self-identified. If you check a box or fill out a housing questionnaire on an enrollment form, it takes a lot to say I'm experiencing homelessness. And if you are an immigrant family, for example, there's then the fear of deportation or child protective services getting involved because we are not communicating to families that this is not to get you in trouble, it's because we have services to help. So when we think about all the needs of infants and toddlers experiencing homelessness, and then the barriers that families often face to get there, quite literally and figuratively, it's important then to think about how we build our programs and our budgets around those experiences. And I'll get into the data in another question.
Great, thank you. That was a lot of good information. Some of it troubling, but also good to hear. Patty, I wanted to go back to you. Bruce talked about this a little bit in the opening, but could you say more about some of the complexity of the brain development and why that also matters in terms of making sure we have robust investments in our infants and toddlers?
Sure. So we've been at the budget level, we've been at the program level, at the family level, program, individual, and now we're gonna get down to the cellular level. So our brains grow the fastest from birth to age 3 than at any other time in our life. And when you think that there must be a lot going on behind those little faces that you see, you're absolutely right. Babies' brains are forming 1 million new neural connections every single second. And so all later brain development, in other words, all later learning, will be built on the foundation that's being laid in those first 3 years. So it's very simple, actually. When babies get what they need to thrive, that foundation is going to be really strong, and therefore all their later learning, it's much easier to stack up on a strong foundation than it is on something that's rickety. If they don't get those ingredients, that foundation may be weakened, and that places them at a disadvantage later in life. So we've talked about some of the basic ingredients, but the most important ingredient in their development is their relationships with the trusted adults in their lives, their parents, or their other close caregivers. So when families have time together to bond, when they know they can meet their basic needs and they can just nurture their children, that is an important boost for brain development. And it's a buffer from adverse experiences. So we need to be supporting parents because they are really the conduit for that magic that happens in babies' brains. But when parents are constantly stressed from trying to make ends meet or worrying about safety, wanting to get the program, then babies feel stressed as well. And when that becomes chronic, that becomes the situation they're in all the time, that can undermine their brain development. So as a society, we need all of our babies to thrive. And so families, we know that face many challenges today. We've heard from Stacy and Haley, and we know that ourselves. And the programs in the baby budget are recognition of this really important role that families play and the work that they do and the needs of their babies. But it's also an investment in our future that Stacy talked about. So I think about it this way, we are leaving this generation of young children with some really serious problems to be invested in grow up, things like climate change. and other things. And so we should be making every investment now to ensure they have that strong foundation, so they can be prepared to make these happen.
Great, thank you, Patty. Erin, coming back to you on some of the research that you all have been doing in terms of, I guess, housing trends, but some of the housing challenges too for our babies.
Absolutely. School House Connection recently released a report earlier this year, which estimated there are over 360,000 infants and toddlers experiencing homelessness across the U.S. I'm going to say that again. Over 360,000 babies are experiencing homelessness across the United States. And so when we look at the wide range of programs and supports available to them, it's important that we are designing them to address those specific needs. And so you've heard a couple different times now that homelessness and housing has increased. And in fact, homelessness has increased 16% among families with children in 2023, and that's among families who are visibly homeless. So that's a statistic from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. And so if we know that there's been a 16% increase in homelessness among families who are visibly homeless, then we can surmise that there has been an even greater increase among families who are in the motels and living doubled up and going from one place to the next. And so that's important to keep in mind as we're building our solutions. It's also important, Patty also mentioned thinking about parents. It's also important to call out this unique connection between older youth experiencing homelessness and then those who become pregnant or parenting. And we know from a Chapin Hall study that 40% of young mothers between the ages of 18 and 25 who experience homelessness are also parents to 1.1 million children across the US. And so there is a huge correlation between the experience of homelessness in the older teenage and young adult years and becoming pregnant and parenting. And when you think about two generational approaches and supports, it's important to keep in mind who are we targeting and who are we proactively reaching out to. We know from research that the younger and longer a child experiences homelessness, the greater the cumulative toll of negative health outcomes, and those impacts remain even after the child and their family have been permanently housed. And so when we think about housing solutions, I want to impart to you that investing in housing alone will not necessarily mean an investment in the impacts of homelessness, because a child who carries the stress of homelessness will carry that stress under a permanent roof as well if we do not also invest in early childhood development programs and health programs and all of the other resources that families need. Not to mention the fact that investing in HUD is not touching about 80% of families with young children who are experiencing homelessness and who are not eligible for HUD-funded programs because they don't meet that narrow definition. And so I will probably say some of that to you again to repeat and refrain and carry with you as you go into your offices and your roles. But it's important to understand the range and experience of homelessness and how that translates into our policy and budgets.
Great, that was important to hear. I thank you for that. We thank you for that. So I'm looking at the clock here a little bit, and so I want to go back to where we are in Congress and the important decisions that are ahead of us. Number one, right in front of us, this Thursday, the Senate will take a procedural vote on whether or not to proceed on a tax package that includes an extension of the child tax credit. That's this Thursday. So that's as near term as we can get to investing in kids. And we need to hold those accountable who vote against that procedural vote. And we heard from Chris earlier how under the president's budget, the child tax credit is a significant reason that we see an uptick in the share of spending on kids. In addition, we know how well it worked and all the positive outcomes that came from the expanded child tax credit back in 2021. I mean, we cut poverty nearly in half with one big policy change. So that's one thing I want to say, because it's just 2 days away. And then Congress, the Senate is continuing to mark up appropriations bills. I think they're looking at 4 different bills on Thursday morning. That includes a number of the bills that fund the programs you've heard about here today. And then when they come back in September, there's a whole lot going on. We are looking at finishing the annual spending bills. There's likely to be some supplemental funding to address the bridge crisis in Baltimore and the wildfires and other things, but potentially on the table is increased funding for childcare, for example. I don't know if there's some housing in there, I forget. Yeah, and some housing in there as well. And then we have a debt limit debate that is looming. And on top of that, the larger, broader tax debate is already being negotiated. So there are a lot of important decisions happening here, yet this Congress and going into next. And we just thank you for coming and hearing all of us talk about these things today and the overview of our babies in the budget. And then I'm going to pause and say to each of the panelists, is there a takeaway message that you want to share now as we're at the 3 o'clock hour, and just give people something to think about and bring back to their bosses or their organizations where they work. And again, with many thanks.
I can go, because you inspired me. And this is more me putting on like a teacher's hat versus a mother's hat. Obviously, being a mom is the greatest thing that's ever happened to me, but I also am a teacher because I really just enjoy kids. And I recognize that they are the future of our country. And my wife and I often joke like, oh, free and public education for all. Who decided that that doesn't start until 5 years old? Why is it that we wait until kids are 5 years old to start taking care of them? Why is it that we don't enrich them and make sure they are supported before they enter kindergarten when they're 5 years old? Like, why is that? It doesn't make sense. I can assure you that by the time kids reach me in 8th grade, 13 and 14 years old, I can tell you which one of those kids had an enriching early childhood and those that didn't. Because it is something that follows them for the rest of their academic careers, and then guess what? It follows them for the rest of their lives. It is just shocking to me of all the things that the government subsidizes and invests in that we don't make investing in the literal future a higher priority. So it is my hope that that is something that will change and that we will continue to make a bigger priority because it really, really matters.
Thank you. Stacey? I guess just to go off of what Haley said, investing in children is very important, especially to me. It's almost like a preventative measure. When you invest in children and you give them all of the supports they need, all of the things they need in order to succeed, we won't have it where they're like 5, 6, 7 years old and we're trying to put a Band-Aid on a situation that could have been prevented with the right support. So I'm always gonna want to have an investment in children. I know it's kind of cliche, but they are the future. And so I think that's why it's important for me. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you both being here. Patty or Erin? Thanks.
You've heard our moms speak, and I can't do better than that. So we have Sterling Thunder. But so I'll just say, we need to do big things for babies. We need what we call it 0 to 3, the big bold baby agenda. And that is things like the expanded child tax credit. We need a comprehensive child care system. We need paid family medical leave. We need all sorts of family supports to pull it all together. We need housing. Babies need everything. And I just want people to think about this, as Michelle mentioned, the tax debate that has already started. And we think about, yes, we want, for the kids part, we want the child tax credit, we want it expanded, and we want it fully refundable. But we also want to think about the revenue side, because to do that big, bold agenda that our babies really need, we have to have revenue. So as you are working with your bosses and thinking, wow, where do you come out on that? We have to have the wherewithal to make sure that our kids thrive now so that our country thrives in the future.
I would also just add, I'll repeat my refrain again, investing in housing does not necessarily translate to investment to combat the impacts of homelessness on young children. We saw an increase in HUD's budget, and that's great, but it does not do nearly enough or anything at all to address the reality that there's been a 16% increase in families experiencing homelessness. And there is still no directive for HUD to implement what they are required to do to connect families with young children to early childhood programs. That's not to mention the fact that that won't even touch, as I mentioned earlier, the 80% of infants and toddlers who don't qualify for HUD homeless assistance. And so I would leave you with that, and as you're reviewing budgets, as you're looking at potential policy moves, ask yourself, how is this putting babies first? How are we addressing the baby as an actual human being and an individual who deserves specialized attention for their unique needs in these early years? Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all. I thank my colleagues very much, and most of all, I thank you for attending, and taking notes and thinking through what we're sharing here today. 2 quick takeaways, I would say. The share of federal spending on babies is less than 2%. It's at 1.52%, and it has been declining for the past 3 years. If those are the 2 things you take back to your boss and your colleagues, that would be helpful, and we hope you take a look at the larger report. And again, thank you for being here, and if there are snacks left, please take some with you. So, thank you.